Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. God's omnipotence is one of the great mysteries of our faith. It's actually very hard for human minds to understand this. How do we explain this mystery? Well, even if God's power is unlimited, doesn't it seem like there's still something here that calls for explanation? Pat Flynn joins us. Pat's a dear friend. He is a brilliant philosopher, author of The Best Argument for God, host of The Pat Flynn Show, and Philosophy for the People. Find his Substack blog at The Journal of Absolute Truth. Pat, great to speak with you, my friend. How are you?
Always a pleasure to be with you, Marcus. I'm well. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Very well. So, God is omnipotent. I want to begin by... I know you get this very, very often, but for the interest of our listeners, I think it's important we address this. Just because God is omnipotent, it doesn't mean that he can do virtually anything. Why is that? So, like, God can't create a rock he can't lift.
Yeah, that's right. So some people are surprised to hear, on the one hand, that God is omnipotent, and yet that there seems to be certain constraints, that there are some things that God cannot do, like lift a stone that's too heavy, or create a square circle, or swim in a lake of cheese. And there's actually, and I would actually argue that God also can't actualize a world with just one burning kitten in it for all of eternity, right, to give a different example. And you begin to resolve these issues through a couple of different ways, but I'll highlight a few that I think are fruitful. And what you arrive at is, I think, a better understanding of what omnipotence means. So traditionally, omnipotence just didn't mean the ability to just do anything. It always related to production. The traditional way that one reached God's omnipotence was working through the order of producible beings back towards the one unique source that produces everything aside from itself, right? The unproduced producer. So omnipotence always related just to production, not just doing anything, right? So once that's understood, you already have a sort of constrained view of omnipotence, which is arrived at through natural theology, rather than what goes on in a lot of kind of contemporary philosophy of religion. People just start with some sort of broad stipulative definition of omnipotence. I think that's a problem, because it leads to lots of paradoxes. When you move through natural theology, you have a more constrained view. But then you start to think about what sorts of things are actually producible in the first place, right? And I think very quickly we can start to see that some things are just not producible even for omnipotent God, because there's something about them that's contradictory, right? Like a stone is something that's material. Every material thing by nature is movable. So to say that a stone isn't movable is really, the contradiction isn't explicit, but it's buried in there, right? This is sort of an impossible structure because it's a contradictory structure, right? And to my mind, the laws of logic follow the laws of being, and God, of course, just is pure being. So it's all this is grounded in God's nature, right? There's a rational order to the structure of reality. So it's not like it's not saying that God's weak or any sense. It's just saying that our imaginations can often run wild beyond the bounds of what is really possible, right? That's the way to think about that. So there's some, and then with the kind of burning kitten example. It's a cute one I like to use to show how the sort of goodness of God's nature is perfectly good, I think constrains the realm of possible worlds insofar that there is some lower bound, amount of goodness, right, that would have to be produced for a world to even be compatible with God's nature. Now, I'm a bit of a skeptic in saying I don't think we can know exactly where that lower bound is, but I think we can give some pretty far-fetched examples that we can say, yeah, that's clearly beyond it. So those are a few ways to start thinking about the complex topic of omnipotence. How does all that sound to you, Marcus?
It all sounds really good, and what you've just said reminds me of something Ratzinger said in the Regensburg Address. To act in a manner that's contrary to reason is contrary to the nature of God. Now, the Muslims who would retaliate at this would get mad because that seems like binding God to a category, because within Islamic philosophy, God cannot be bound by any category. But explain to us why this isn't limiting on the omnipotence of God. It actually speaks to his omnipotence.
Yeah, I think so we'll go back to God, not being able to create contradictory structures. I think when you analyze what's going on with like a square circle, you realize that ontological boundaries, the boundaries that make something what it is rather than something else, exclude. So the boundaries that make a square necessarily by those properties exclude being a circle. So when you're talking about a square or circle, you're talking about really a negation of being, right? Which is just nothing at the end of the day. So I really think these statements are just nonsense. They don't even make sense at the end of the day. So I don't think you want to say that God would be involved in the business of nonsense, right? If God is an absolutely perfect being, then it would seem like he is the height or the hallmark or the paradigm of rationality, of intelligibility, and all that. And I think we can have a good story to show how God's nature as pure being grounds all the laws of logic. Because I think the laws of logic just follow the laws of being, the laws of ontologic, right? I certainly don't think that this limits God's power, because when we say that all things are possible with God, we have to be talking about something in the first place, not just a bunch of words that might seem to be coherent upon initial impression, but turn out to actually be nothing but gibberish or nonsense, if that makes sense.
And
not only that, but I mean, think about just to go a little bit further, right? But if God was really, as some of these, I think, more radical voluntarists assume, this is a sort of voluntaristic position, right? I think then God can create a stone too heavy to lift, right? But God could also lie, right? And then there's no reason to trust the revelation that was delivered to you, to believe in such a God. And I think you wind up in some pretty radically, especially religiously skeptical scenarios if you start to push down that path too hard, like very, very catastrophically, bad positions to be in, both philosophically and religiously.
You read my mind. That was going to be my follow-up question. If we believe that God can contradict the very bounds of reason, despite the fact that he is reason itself, then we must, by necessity, believe that he can change his mind. Explain to us why that's horrifying.
Yeah, well, for exactly what we just said, right? If you it's not just that God is mutable. I think that God is immutable, as we've talked about on previous episodes too. But if God can sort of flagrantly contradict his own nature, the laws of logic, produce absurdities, then I think you really do wind up in these radically skeptical scenarios. What reasons do you have to trust any of the presumed revelation that was delivered by such a God, right? I mean, the reason we think that revelation is reliable is because God has a certain nature. God is not just truthful, God is truth, right? God doesn't just have some degree of goodness, God is the good. This is the form of theism that I think can provide a really robust foundation for a reliable religious epistemology. I think a reliable epistemology, a theory of knowledge in general. I think you start to veer off into these voluntarist positions. Not only do you just have a lot of silly positions in general, I think it really does lead to these radically skeptical, ultimately self-defeating scenarios at the end of the day, that the revelation that you think describes God in these absurd ways is no longer something that should be taken as reliable because it describes God in those absurd ways. And
that's precisely why when we think about God, we have to think about the confines of reason. And that actually has great bearings on the way we ought to think about morality as well. Can you please speak to that as a Christian?
Yeah, well, morality is a rational enterprise, right? I mean, morality is something that sort of comes online when you have beings like us that can consider the space of reasons and deliberate about different means to ends. So morality is not something that's detached from reason. It's a sort of expression of reason for particular creatures concerning means to ends and deliberation and stuff like that. So on one level, we use reason all the time in moral decision-making, right? So we need a sort of stable, orderly, intelligible structure where things are predictable and discernible, at least in the general run. And I do think we need to go beyond that with special revelation. And I think that we have that supplied by God because God would know that we need that. But again, if you have this sort of radically voluntarist conception of God, there's not only no reason to trust special revelation, there's really no reason to trust the deliverances of nature itself, which informs us to a lot of matters of morality, if that's what you're thinking about, Marcus, yeah.
My guest is Pat Flynn, philosopher, brilliant philosopher, author of The Best Argument for God, blogger at the Journal of Absolute Truth. We're talking about the fact that God is omnipotent and there are limitations to his omnipotence. Stay tuned, I'm Marcus Peter. Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter, talking with Pat Flynn, philosopher, author of The Best Argument for God, and we are talking about the omnipotence of God. So, Pat, we had touched earlier on how God's omnipotence is limited. There are limitations to his omnipotence, and that's a good thing as it pertains to bearings on our morality. Mm-hmm. The moral life is a necessarily rational endeavor. You made that statement. It's 100% true. Can you please speak into it a little more, especially considering the way modernity tends to think about ethics?
Yeah, definitely. And I want to just be clear when we say that there's limits on God omnipotence. We really, what we should say is there's no arbitrary limits on God's omnipotence. That's what it means. We don't want to seem like there's just some sudden, unexplained cutoff to what God can produce. I mean, when we get to the idea of a square circle, it's pretty clear why God can't produce something like that. That limit is not arbitrary, and in one sense, it's not even really a limit at all, because what we're talking about isn't even a real possibility of being at all, right? A real limit would be something like God not being able to produce one extra turtle or something like that. And certainly, I think that that's something God can do, right? Where there's no sort of relevant, clear, obvious difference between why God could produce 13 but not 14 turtles, for example. So just a point of clarification there. Now, sorry, now that I said that, I forgot what you said about morality, if you wouldn't mind just repeating your question.
Sure. So morality is a necessarily rational endeavor. There's a lot of wisdom in that, and unfortunately, modernity makes that sentence sound tremendously novel. Please explain to us, juxtapose the way we ought to think about morality compared to how modernity thinks about ethics today.
Yeah, good. All right. So the traditional account of morality that is sort of baptized by Catholicism is coming down from Aristotle and even the Stoics, and this great traditional natural law account of morality. And it's really a very common sense understanding of morality. What it does is it says, hey, well, what is good for something depends on the kind of thing that is under consideration. So human beings are rational animals, and there's certain sort of obvious things that are good for us given our nature. And it just so happens that our nature even informs us in a sort of intuitive way of what many of these goods are. We intuitively know that having knowledge is good. We intuitively know that having friendship is good. We intuitively know that being just is good, and so on and so forth. It's a sort of classic virtue ethic understanding of morality. Where Christianity comes in and sort of completes the picture and refines it, is it differentiates between the natural goods and the supernatural goods. And the natural goods are still very important. In a certain way, they sort of incline or predispose us to the supernatural good and the ultimate end, which for us is, of course, union with God, the ultimate source of truth and goodness, the final end state of a human being possessed of intellect and will, which are ordered towards truth and goodness, right? So the good life for the human being ultimately is the matter for Christians is really rather very black and white. Do you attain this intimate union with God, this intimate friendship with God, traditionally called the beatific vision, or do you not, or do you suffer eternal separation from God? Now, matters are a lot more complicated leading up to that, considering the natural virtues and the complicated relationship between grace and human freedom, which we have spoken about on previous episodes. But the point is, a lot of our sort of basic moral epistemology comes from our nature. Our nature sort of tells us a lot of things that are sort of good for us, and we generally have widespread agreement on that. We tend to disagree when it gets down to certain factual details and fine-grained matters, but nobody thinks, for example, that stabbing your best friend in the back routinely is some sort of virtue, right? We all know what the kind of general swath of goods are and what the general swath of evils or bads are. Now, that's a teleological view of morality, and the kind of contemporary view of morality, if there is one on the table, would be something kind of more like an accounting view of morality, where people just kind of collect together a bunch of properties they think are good-making or goodness-conferring, and a bunch of properties that they think are bad-making or badness-conferring, and they sort of weigh them out. And does, this person or this state of affair have more goodness-conferring properties or more badness-conferring properties? And one could see how something like that could quickly slip into a sort of hedonism or something like that, right? And that is very, very much not the traditional understanding of what the human good life is or consists in. I don't think it accords with our nature at all. I don't think it's a common sense view of morality at all. But to connect what we're talking about here to the notion of God as being rational and so on and so forth, and avoiding this extremely voluntaristic conception of God, we take it that our sort of basic moral intuitions about what is good or bad, right and wrong, so on and so forth, that are sort of supplied to us by nature are reliable. But if we had this sort of higher order conception of God, who is the reason that we have the nature that we do, and the nature seems to be aimed at the certain ends that it is aimed at, if we have that sort of radical skepticism at the higher order about God being himself utterly irrational, then we lose the sort of reliability that we have at the lower order, I would argue, for taking what seems to be the case morally to actually be the case. So I think this is really important. I don't think you have to always think about what is the case at the sort of higher order or meta level of theorizing, say meta-ethics or meta-epistemology or whatever. But when you do think about it, if you have a certain story up there that produces these sorts of, I think, radically absurd or radically skeptical scenarios, then what you have is a situation where that skepticism then should trickle down and cause you to doubt many of the great things that you were previously committed to, whether it with its respect to morality or epistemology or revelation or what have you. So I don't know if that answers your question directly, but I tried to compare different accounts of morality and then also tie it back into why this matters with respect to how we think about God and God's omnipotence and all that. Mm-hmm.
Oh, no, it absolutely answers my question, which, please pardon me, which leads to then the further question. It's not just about morality that's the issue. You already touched on this a little bit, which is if we don't have rational limits, so the categories of reason, when we think about God's omnipotence, we don't have an ability to think about what's good. You know, like, what does it mean to say God is good if reason doesn't come into bear?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think that for the classical theists and the tradition we're talking about, goodness is thoroughly primitive. It's convertible with existence. God as a being of pure existence is pure goodness. And I think that itself constrains the sorts of things that God can make, the sorts of natures there are. Why? Because any nature that is possible is something that has to appropriately image the divine essence, right? So anything that is a possible being is only possible if it has at least some adequate amount, we might say, of ontological affinity with the divine image. There's some story we can say about how this thing, in its finite way, bears an adequate resemblance or reflection of the divine. So that itself is another constraint or limit on what is possible. But once you have that in place, then everything that exists, insofar as it just exists in a basic way, is good because it somehow, in some however limited a way, reflects the divine essence. And I think that's the correct position. But then from there, of course, most things aren't just already in their end state, right? They're ordered to a further state after that, which may or may not be realized, may or may not be actualized. But for us, for human beings, to the extent that we further exercise our rationality to discern what is really good for us and pursue that and attain it, we become sort of further actualized along what's called our species-specifying potential, which relates to our rationality. We further image God. We further participate in the goodness of God, and hopefully, God willing, that will culminate in the beatific vision at the end of the day. So related to all this stuff about God's omnipotence, there's also the sort of moral constraints when you understand that God is not just all-powerful, but just is the good itself. That itself is another constraint of the realm of possible beings. Again, I don't think we know exactly where the lines are, but I think we can confidently say the things that I've just said, that all possible beings are constrained not just by the laws of logic, but by the very notion that God is the good itself, and there has to be some sort of affinity between whatever God creates and the divine essence as well.
So, as we think about living the good life in that regard, one of the things that immediately comes to mind, like you just mentioned, is the notion of the beatific vision. You talk with, I guess, the average agnostic and even, I don't know, maybe light theist. They all want the concept of a happy or pleasant eternal life. The problem is which version, which one, because I can tell you right now, the Islamic Jannah, it does not comport with the Catholic beatific vision.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'm not an expert in Islamic theology, but my understanding is that there's some very radically different conceptions of what the next life looks like. I want to comment on that in a minute. I also want to go back, and because you brought up another point about knowing what is good for us and knowing what is good, that I think is important to draw out as well. And that is that a lot of ethicists, when they're talking about moral theory, talk about this idea of moral constraint. So sometimes they talk about that there's moral facts, right? And that these moral facts don't depend on our preferences. Like it is really wrong to slander people for fun. And it has nothing to do whether you like it or dislike it. It is objectively wrong. But they also talk about moral constraints. And the idea there is no matter how the world could have been, morality is substantively constrained, right? It could not have been the case in any possible world that it could have been good to slander people for fun. There's substantive constraints to the sort of domain of moral facts. And one thing I think is really attractive about the view that we endorse, Marcus, I'm just talking about, is it gives you the foundation for moral constraint by having everything constrained in the sort of goodness of the divine essence of having to have an affinity with God. I hear the music, so we'll have to visit the afterlife question next time. But I wanted to get that last point in at least.
I'm really glad, Pat. Thank you so much for your time. My guest has been Pat Flynn, philosopher and the author of The Best Argument for God. And he and I have been talking about how God is omnipotent, and yet there are reasonable limits to his omnipotence. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter.